Here's a date that should change everything you think you know about American history. 1513. Not 1619, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in colonial Virginia. Not 1492, when Columbus landed in the Caribbean. Not even 1620, when the Pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower onto Plymouth Rock. 1513. And before I tell you what happened that year, I need you to hold on to one question as you watch every single minute of this video. If this story described any other group of people already living in America before Columbus, would it be in every history textbook in this country? In September of 1513, a Spanish conquistador named Vasco Núñez de Balboa hacked his way through the most impenetrable jungle on Earth, the Darién Gap, the narrow land bridge connecting North and South America in what is now the nation of Panama. His goal was to find a sea that indigenous people had whispered about for generations, a vast, unknown ocean to the south. He became the first European to lay eyes on the Pacific Ocean from American soil. That part of the story everyone knows, but there is a part of his story that almost nobody tells. Somewhere in those jungle mountain passes, between two oceans, in terrain so thick that modern soldiers still refuse to cross it without specialized training, Balboa's company received a report from local indigenous leaders. And that report was recorded by the Spanish Crown's own official historian in a document that still exists today that you can read right now if you know where to look. And that document described something no one in 1513 was prepared to explain. Black-skinned people, already living in the American interior. Not newly arrived, not brought by anyone, already there. I am not talking about a rumor or folklore. I am talking about an official document written for the King of Spain by a man whose entire job was to record exactly what was being discovered in the New World. And in that document, written in 1516, he described black-skinned people in the Americas in 1513. Then, and this is the part that should make every single one of you uncomfortable, that document spent the next 500 years being filed, explained away, and quietly buried under the weight of official history. This is History Morsels, and this is the story they buried. To understand what makes the 1513 account so significant, you first need to understand who Balboa was, what world he was operating in, and what the men around him actually knew about human diversity by the time they reached those jungle passes. Vasco Núñez de Balboa was born in Jerez de los Caballeros, Spain, around 1475. He was the son of a minor noble family, educated enough to understand how power worked, but too poor to inherit a comfortable life. He crossed the Atlantic for the first time around 1500, drawn by the same fever that had infected an entire generation of young Spaniards, the New World and the wealth it promised. He settled on the island of Hispaniola, today's Haiti and Dominican Republic, and spent the next decade grinding through one failure after another. He tried farming, he fell into debt, and by some accounts, he escaped his creditors by hiding aboard a departing ship. Some sources say inside a barrel, others say sewn inside a ship's sail, and sailing away to a struggling colonial settlement on the coast of what is now Colombia. It was there that Balboa's fortunes finally turned. He had a quality that was rare among conquistadors. He could read people. He was hard when hardness was required, but he could also build genuine alliances with indigenous leaders in ways most Spanish settlers never managed. By 1510, he had maneuvered himself into command of the settlement and co-founded a colony called Santa María la Antigua del Darién, the first permanent European settlement on the American mainland. But his position was never secure. Back in Spain, rivals were writing letters to the king, questioning his methods and his authority. He needed a triumph, something so undeniable and so valuable to the Spanish Empire that no political enemy could take his standing away from him. And the stories the indigenous people told him about a great sea to the south and the incomprehensible wealth of kingdoms beyond it pointed him toward exactly that kind of triumph. On the 1st of September 1513, Balboa assembled his force, 190 Spanish soldiers armed with steel, crossbows, and early firearms, and approximately 800 indigenous guides, warriors, and support workers drawn from the allied tribes around Darién. He was marching into country no European had ever entered, with no maps and no reliable intelligence, only the word of indigenous leaders and the resolve of a man with everything to prove. But here is what matters most for our story. The men in Balboa's company had been living in the Caribbean and on the mainland since the turn of the century. They had spent more than a decade observing the full range of complexion and physical feature across the indigenous populations of the Caribbean basin. And by 1513, small numbers of African people had already been brought to the Caribbean. The first documented Africans in the New World arrived around 1501. So Balboa's men also knew what black-complexioned people looked like. These were not naive observers. When something in that jungle shocked them enough for the Crown's own historian to write it down, it was not because these men could not tell one kind of person from another. Now let us talk about the document itself and the man who wrote it. Pietro Martir d'Anghiera, known in English as Peter Martyr d'Anghiera, was Italian, born in 1557, and he spent most of his adult life at the Spanish royal court. He was appointed official historian of the Council of the Indies, the governing body that oversaw all of Spain's colonial affairs. He interviewed returning explorers personally, read official dispatches and field logs, and compiled everything into a series of chronicles he called decades, 10-year blocks of New World history, written in Latin, addressed to the most powerful audiences in Europe. That work is called De Orbe Novo, of the New World. The first edition appeared in 1511. A fuller edition containing Decade 3, the section covering 1513 and 1514, was published in 1516. This was not some obscure manuscript. De Orbe Novo was one of the most widely read books in 16th century Europe, translated and reprinted across the continent, used by kings, cardinals, and courts. It was dedicated in its opening pages to Pope Leo X himself. And in Decade 3, in the section covering Balboa's 1513 crossing of the Darién, Pietro Martir records this. As Balboa's company moved through the mountain passes of the isthmus, they encountered multiple indigenous chieftains and their communities. Near a territory the Spanish called the province of Quareca, in the highland passes between the two coasts, a chieftain described to Balboa a group of people living at a distance of 2 days' journey away. These people were black in color, not simply dark-complexioned within the indigenous range, black, with features and physical characteristics that the chieftain described as unmistakably distinct from all surrounding indigenous populations. They were not newcomers to the region. They were established, they held their own territory, and they were in a state of ongoing, apparently long-standing conflict with the tribes around them. Let me ask you a direct question right here. If this document described any other group of people already in America before Columbus, do you think it would be a footnote? Drop your answer in the comments. For 500 years, mainstream historians have had to decide what to do with this passage, and the way they have handled it reveals more about the needs of official narrative than about the actual contents of Peter Martyr's text. The first response is the translation argument. Peter Martyr wrote in Latin, working from Spanish oral reports. The vocabulary of the period could, some scholars argue, simply describe people of a darker complexion within the natural range of indigenous variation. So perhaps what Balboa's men encountered was just an indigenous group somewhat darker skinned than those they had been living near for a decade. Under this reading, black is a translation artifact, a careless amplification of something unremarkable. But this argument has a fatal flaw. If the people in question were within the normal range of indigenous American appearance, there is no reason for hardened veterans with over a decade of Caribbean experience to react with astonishment. The only reason their reaction was notable enough for Peter Martyr to record is if what they were hearing about was genuinely outside that spectrum. The second explanation is more sophisticated, which makes it more dangerous. Historians call it the early Maroon theory. The argument goes like this. The small numbers of African people brought to the Caribbean beginning around 1501 included some who escaped enslavement, fled their colonial settlements, made their way to the mainland, and established communities in the interior of Panama. These early runaways would have been black-complexioned, present before Balboa arrived, and in conflict with surrounding indigenous communities. This sounds plausible until you do the mathematics. By 1513, the total number of African people transported across the Atlantic amounted to fewer than 1,000, spread across the entire Caribbean colonial. A fraction of those were in a position to escape. A fraction of that fraction could have reached the mainland and survived in the interior jungles of Panama. What you are left with is a number so small it could not have formed the kind of established territorial community described in Peter Martyr's account, a community recognized by multiple indigenous chieftains as a known and persistent neighbor of long standing. The numbers do not add up. And it is remarkable how rarely this basic arithmetic appears in the papers that cite the early Maroon theory as the obvious answer. What do you think? Is there an explanation I am missing? Drop it in the comments. Balboa's 1513 account did not stand alone in the early colonial record. It was part of a pattern, and that pattern deserves to be examined carefully. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés, known as Oviedo, was one of the most prolific and exacting chroniclers of the early colonial Americas. Unlike Peter Martyr, who wrote from the Spanish court, Oviedo was there in person. He arrived in the New World in 1514, just 1 year after Balboa's crossing, and spent the next 3 decades moving between Spain and the Americas, observing and recording everything he encountered. His Historia General y Natural de las Indias, the general and natural history of the Indies, stretched across 19 published volumes and is one of the foundational documents of early American history. Oviedo was harshly critical of earlier writers he considered careless with the facts. And yet, in his own work, when describing certain communities in the mainland interior, he made consistent note of physical characteristics he carefully distinguished from the indigenous populations he had catalogued elsewhere, features he struggled to fit into any European category he knew. And then there is a history far deeper than any colonial chronicle, a history that goes not 5 years before Balboa, but 3,000 years. Beginning around 1500 BCE, a civilization rose on the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico. Archaeologists call them the Olmec, the foundational civilization of Mesoamerica, the cultural ancestors of the Maya and the Aztec. They built cities, developed early writing, and left behind 17 colossal stone heads, the largest weighing over 40 tons, carved from basalt transported from quarries miles away. The faces carved into those heads, the broad, flat nose, the full, rounded lips, the wide, powerful jaw, have been described by generations of observers, including academic archaeologists, as bearing the characteristics of sub-Saharan African facial structure. Mainstream archaeology responds that these are simply Olmec faces reflecting the natural diversity of ancient Mesoamerican people, and that is a fair point. It is not proof either way, but it is an open question that keeps returning, and it connects to the 1513 account in one specific way. If the Americas had ancient populations whose physical features overlapped with African appearances, then the people Balboa's company heard about in the Darién might not have been recent arrivals from anywhere. They might have been exactly what the chieftain described, established people in territory they had held for a very long time. In 2015, science added a dimension to this question that most Americans have never heard about, and it came not from a fringe source, but from Harvard University and the journal Nature. A research team led by Pontus Skoglund, working under David Reich, one of the world's leading experts in ancient population genetics, published findings on the DNA of indigenous South American populations in the Amazon basin. And in certain communities, specifically the Suru and the Caritiana peoples of Brazil, they found a genetic signature that the standard model of how humans arrived in the Americas could not account for. The standard model holds that all indigenous Americans descended from a single source population that crossed from Siberia into North America roughly 15,000 years ago and spread south from there. But the signal in those Amazonian communities was different. It was related to Australo-Melanesian populations, the ancient peoples of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Populations that in physical terms present with very dark skin, dense textured hair, and facial features that early European observers consistently described as resembling those of sub-Saharan Africans. What this suggests is striking. The Americas may have had a very early population, possibly arriving 30,000 or more years ago via ancient coastal migration routes that rising sea levels have since submerged, who would have appeared phenotypically distinct from the later Siberian descended migrants. Over tens of thousands of years, this early population would largely have been absorbed, displaced, or intermixed with later arrivals, but remnant populations may have persisted in isolated, interior, highland jungle pockets, exactly the kind of isolated interior that Balboa was crossing in 1513. This is not a YouTube hypothesis. This is peer-reviewed science published in the most prestigious scientific journal on Earth, produced by Harvard geneticists. And most Americans have never heard a single word of it. What do you think that silence means? I want your honest answer in the comments below. Now let me step back from the evidence for a moment and ask the larger question that all of it points toward. Why does it matter? It matters because the story we have been taught about the Americas, about who was here, who was brought here, who was indigenous, and who was imported, was not written by the people who lived those histories. It was written by their conquerors, their enslavers, and the historians those conquerors employed. And those historians operated within a world that had very specific needs. The colonial world ran on clean categories. Indigenous people had one legal status. Enslaved Africans had another. The entire architecture of colonial land rights, labor systems, and racial hierarchy depended on the ability to classify and sort human beings with precision. A story in which the Americas already contained people who looked like Africans, people whose presence predated not just the slave trade, but possibly Columbus himself, was not just inconvenient, it was structurally incompatible with everything the colonial world needed to believe about itself. So the account got filed. It got surrounded with language like probably and most likely and we can reasonably assume. Generation after generation of historians repeated the hedge instead of questioning it, until the hedge became the consensus, and the consensus became the textbook, and the textbook became what your teachers told you was the complete story. This is how history gets rewritten, not with fire, with paperwork, with the slow accumulation of official certainty about things that were never actually settled. Think about what would have to change if this question were taken seriously. Think about the historical and cultural categories that would have to be re-examined. And tell me honestly in the comments, is that why the conversation has not happened? Or is there a simpler explanation? Here is where we land. Not at a conclusion, because this story does not have one yet, but at a reckoning. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Darién. His company received a report from indigenous leaders about black-skinned people living in the interior, people who were established, territorial, in ongoing conflict with their neighbors, described as a long-standing presence in the landscape. Pietro Martir d'Anguera, Peter Martyr, the Spanish crown's appointed historian, wrote this account in De Orbe Novo, Decade 3, published in 1516, addressed to the Pope of Rome. That document has existed for more than 500 years. It is not hidden. It is not in a sealed archive. The passage about the black-skinned people of the Darién is right there, available to any scholar who looks, and it describes black-skinned people in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade could account for their presence. 3 explanations have been offered across 5 centuries. The first says misidentification, darker indigenous people described carelessly. It fails because experienced men with a decade in the Caribbean reacted with documented astonishment. The second says early Maroons, escaped Africans from the first colonial settlements. It fails because the arithmetic of early colonial populations cannot support an established interior community with territory and long-standing enemies. The third says something more unsettling, that the Americas have always been older, more diverse, and more complex than the story we inherited from the people who needed it simple. In 2015, Harvard geneticists found Australo-Melanesian DNA in Amazonian populations that the standard migration model cannot explain alone. Ancient populations with phenotypic features we would describe as African may have existed in this hemisphere for tens of thousands of years, long before Columbus, long before the slave ships, long before any of the categories that organize our understanding of who belongs here were ever invented. None of this proves any single theory, but all of it together is a question that 500 years of official history has failed to answer honestly. Balboa found black people already living in America. His historian wrote it down, and for 5 centuries the official record has passed over it, explained it away, and filed it under anomaly. How many anomalies have to accumulate before we call them something else? If this video raised questions you were never taught to ask, subscribe to History Morsels and share it with someone who thinks the full story of America has already been told. Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to go further, start with Peter Martyr's De Orbe Novo, Decade 3. Read the passage, then come back here and tell me whether you still think it is a footnote. The story of who was in America first has not been fully told. It starts in 1513. It starts with a Spanish soldier in a jungle, a chieftain in the mountain passes between 2 oceans, and a document sent to the Pope of Rome. 500 years later, maybe we are finally ready to read it.